Oh, you can go to the data tracker.
Yeah, I thought it would just be nice and.
If you go under meetings, the meetings tab, then you can just do materials. Yeah.
Thought I had a nice. Chuck, 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 chuck. Okay. Mimi, edit materials. Slides, upload new slides.
I'll put it back after. It's a little easier to face the room.
Were you thinking of taking that one? Take that one. You made the front row. It's kind of like.
You okay, Buster?
Yep.
Okay. Welcome, everyone, to the More Instant Messaging Interoperability BOF, or MIMI BOF. If that's not the room you're supposed to be in, now you know. So this is the IETF note well that outlines the policies governing this meeting. If you're not familiar with these policies, please take a look, in particular about contributions of IPR and code of conduct. We are definitely expecting to have a very pleasant and respectful meeting today, so please keep the policies in mind. Next. It's Wednesday, so those who have been here are already familiar with this in terms of the tips for using MeetEcho in the room. For those who are here in the room, please sign in to the MIMI session, either using full MeetEcho with audio and video off, or the MeetEcho Lite icon in the data tracker. That's how we're taking attendance today. If you want to speak at any point, please join the mic queue. That's what we'll use to order the contributions from the mic. And please use a mask if you're not actively speaking at the microphone. And for remote participants, same deal. Please join the queue and keep your audio and video off unless you're actively speaking. No masks at home unless you want to. So here's our agenda for today, fairly kind of standard BOF agenda. We'll bash this agenda, and then we'll have Rowan, who's going to present the problem statement for Mimi for about 20 minutes. We'll have time for clarifying questions only at the beginning, and then we'll move into discussion of the charter and the BOF questions at the end. And if we get done in time, we can start a little bit of solutions-based discussion. There's been a lot of robust contributions on the list, and we're happy to use some of that time to get the solutions-based discussion going if we have the time left. Are there anyone who wants to bash the agenda? Okay. Just one additional note before we move on. Can we go back on this agenda? So in the context of MIMI, we're sort of operating with, new regulatory requirements, which are one of the drivers for this work, but not the only driver. And I just wanted to note that this is not an unfamiliar situation in the IETF. We have a long history of sort of an interaction between things that we develop and the broader regulatory environment, especially in the telco space and telecommunications space, with things like STIR and ECRIT and so on. So this is not new for us. It's something that we've done before, and we can think about what the regulatory requirements are, but really what we're mostly focused on is developing the best solutions for the internet and its users. Next. There were a bunch of drafts that were submitted in advance of the BOF. We're not going to be doing, individual draft presentations today, but if you want to familiarize yourself with what was submitted, there's a list in the slide and also in the data tracker if you want to take a look at how people are starting to approach the different topics. And this is for later, so we can kick it over to Rowan.
Hi, everybody. I'm Rowan May.
Hold on. We're getting there.
So while we're waiting, just out of curiosity, how many people here have read the problem statement draft? Okay, good. All right. So the way I'm going to start sort of organizing the problem statement topics, for lack of a better way of doing it, I'm starting sort of from the highest level of the 7-layer stack, not the 9-layer stack, but the 7-layer stack, and moving on from there. I'll also just sort of give a background for anyone who didn't read the BOF proposal. So there's quite a bit of motivation for why we're doing this, and many of the questions that I have been asked by people who were not involved had to do with, you did this many years ago, why are you doing this again? So
Okay.
the chairs asked me to add one slide with that, which hopefully will be non-controversial, and we can move on to the rest of the problem statement.
Okay, there's something. We will now do this. How about that? That work for you?
Yeah.
Okay, we'll do it that way.
You have it in front of you.
Yeah, next slide, please.
Takes longer this way.
Okay. Yeah, so today, instant messaging is widespread. It's got lots of features. It's end-to-end encrypted for the most part. And the experience of trying to figure out how you send an instant message to someone else for the first time is pretty pathetic. Like, oh, are you on Signal? No, what's up? Oh yeah, Wire? No, yeah. And then, you have to have several applications running on your device, and you still might not be able to communicate right away. This lack of interoperability causes a very poor user experience. And so what's different from last time? Well, last time, instant messaging was still pretty basic. So the feature experience now, what's the sort of common set of features among instant messengers is quite robust. And we didn't have widespread end-to-end encryption before. And now there's a lot of external pressure, for example, from the EU Digital Markets Act, in order for us to have interoperability. So we could achieve slowly, bit by bit, interoperability by just letting individual vendors publish their APIs without standardization. But this would perpetuate the status quo. We would end up with probably some pretty poor user experiences and lots of bugs. So the theory behind MIMI is that having a minimal standardized framework that allows for interoperability, but still allows innovation and design decisions by individual clients, that was the goal. Okay. Hearing no one screaming, let's start at the top of the stack. So if you are end-to-end encrypting, you don't get to use a gateway to change the contents that are end-to-end encrypted. It's encrypt once and send and forget. You have to send it. And so we have a number of different things that we need to be able to convey in a message format that are quite common across instant messaging systems. For example, we've got both plain text and rich text messages. We have replies, reactions, mentions, editing a message, deleting a message. Some services support expiring messages, read and delivery receipts. Almost everyone has links to attachments, images, some videos, and some recorded sound. And then finally, many have support for send the sort of initial bootstrap message for starting either a one-on-one or a one-on-one call or a conference, an audio or video conference. So what's important here is that everyone in the group gets the same content from whoever sends content. So we need at least one kind of common minimal set of formats. But there are likely to be many formats out there. So if there are proprietary formats, you need to be able to probably still send those and also send the common format depending on the circumstances. So you need to communicate which formats are supported, which are required, and what is actually sent. The next layer down, we have the actual end-to-end encryption. So we are assuming the use of the messaging layer security protocol, MLS, which was developed here at IETF, and it has some properties which are maybe not obvious to someone who just walks in the room for the first time and takes a look at how do I go and encrypt my messages. So MLS describes two abstract services, an authentication service and a distribution service. And these, in the context of interoperability, a distribution service is very likely to span multiple administrative domains. So the service isn't running on one server over here, and then you have a separate service to talk to the other thing. The service spans all of the domains that are involved. And it also does not specify whether a particular function needs to be accomplished in a client or in a server. So the architecture is quite flexible. And if you're curious about this for more detail, I encourage you to look at the MLS architecture document linked below. It describes what are the decisions that an implementation needs to make about how to deliver a compliant authentication service and a compliant distribution service. Authentication services need to issue credentials, and they need to enable a client to verify that credentials that they receive are as they're presented by another client. The distribution service is responsible for defining what are the ordering rules for handshake messages and for routing the MLS messages. We also need a place to store what are called key packages, which is how you initially, how you get the keying material to initially communicate with someone. And then there are a bunch of administrative and policy knobs. All right.
Did I go twice?
I think you were, yeah, we advanced.
Yeah, I doubled.
You doubled back.
Now.
Perfect, great. Okay, one more layer down. So we need a way to convey the encrypted messages, the MLS messages, to a server, which is sort of the between servers, among servers, and between clients and servers. And so we at minimum need to be able to send these MLS messages. There may be some other features that we also want to communicate using the same protocol. Traditionally, when we were talking about instant messaging, people talk about there's a server-to-server thing over here and a client server-to-server thing over there. For both of these, we could leave these completely undefined, particularly in the server-to-server case. It would be very desirable for us to have at least a standardized description of how to solve this problem. And that would also include not just how you send between two servers that would then become part of the same distribution service, but also how to resolve that specific server for a specific service. From the client to server protocol perspective, so traditionally, in most instant messaging systems, this would be an implementation specific matter, but for MLS, it is critically important that we enumerate what the requirements are for the MLS profile that we're using so that clients can correctly comply with that protocol. All right, this one is a bit subtle. We have lots of identifiers that we use to describe different items in instant messaging. Three of the most important, which are used on basically every IM system, are an identifier used to describe a user of the system, an identifier which is used to describe a client, because in most instant messaging systems, you can have multiple clients for the same user simultaneously. For example, a mobile and a desktop. And then finally, we have what in MLS is called a group, but could be called a conversation, a chat, a channel, something else. But these are all really the same concept. This is the collection of users that I'm communicating with, or the collection of clients that I'm communicating with associated with those users. An identifier that is used internally is not always what the end user sees in a user interface. So in a user interface, you may see something like that looks like a phone number. And in fact, when you search for a user, you may use a phone number or an email address or a full name, or you may have a service handle. The internal identifier may be different. As part of the problem space, we just need to make sure that internal identifiers are compatible with the protocols we use. And we should make sure as well that because our goal is interoperability, that we're not putting a high barrier on an existing service that they have to completely change their service in order to incorporate some identifier that they already use. There it is. Yes. Suspense. Now, we already are assuming that end-to-end encryption is baked in as a first-class citizen in this architecture. End-to-end encryption prevents eavesdropping, but it doesn't prevent impersonation. And one of the largest barriers to interoperability is to make the administrator of a service comfortable or assured that that someone isn't going to impersonate a user on their system, or that they're not going to end up with active attacks that weaken the security of their own system. And one of the concerns there, of course, would be spamming, for example, is a lot easier to do if you can mint a sort of an infinite number of identifiers. So the sort of overall model of how you would do end-to-end identity in MLS is that you have, for each client in a group, that you have a presenting client. The presenting client needs to go and get some kind of credential from some issuing authority. And then it can include that credential in its MLS messages. And any of the clients which receive that, they are now in a position to verify that credential. They can verify that credential either online directly, or there may be an offline mechanism that they can use to verify the credential. So this problem is just about strongly associating a client with a specific user identity, and other clients being able to verify presented identities. We want to make sure that there isn't a huge proliferation of different ways of doing that verification. We want to have one or two different ways of doing that verification that are well-defined and something that we can take to a bake-off. Finally, this stuff is this is one of the areas where we assume that the actual protocol is defined elsewhere, that we're just saying use this one. All right. So related to the identifier problem, we have the introduction problem. This is, how do you get the internal identifier? And how do you obtain permission to start sending messages to someone or inviting them to groups? Now, the first part of this assumes that you know what the target service is. So this would be, I come to Jonathan and I say, Jonathan, do you have Wire? No. Do you have WhatsApp? Yes. Do you have Signal? Yes. Okay. So I take the service and I take the identifier that they use, and I look up Jonathan, and then I get usually a connection request that I use to I send to him, and then if he accepts the connection request, then we can communicate. One of the requirements here is that we preserve the privacy and preferences of the target. The second interesting part here is discovery of the instant messaging service. How do we determine what the target's preferred service is? Okay. Lastly, we have some very useful things that are listed on the current charter as we can ask to do these later. One of these is hooks to prevent spam and abuse. So this is metadata for processing metadata that we can use to manage spam and abuse. Like, was somebody asked to be blocked? Was someone reported? I will just point out that having a strong identity makes it easier to solve this problem. And then we also have, lastly, the problem about how you administer groups and moderate groups. And so if you have two different systems, and a system over here, service A, invites a user who is on service B, we could imagine that without any specification, this could be entirely administered and moderated by users in the first domain, the first service, without any standardized protocol action. But if you wanted to do that across protocols, then you would need some kind of a standardized protocol. That's what I got. Did you have a?
No, I think you should stay. You don't get to sit down yet, because now is the time for clarifying questions on the problem statement.
Wow, I did not expect to be the first person in line here. Thanks for the presentation. One question that came up is we're talking about sort of like client to server interoperability as well as server to server interoperability. Do we have like a preferred or understood preferred model for which one we want to support first, right? Like, so, I am, a member of service X, there's service X to service Y interop between those servers versus I have client X and can connect to server for service Y to send message to like, is this left open? Am I opening the wrong can of worms too early?
Let me just say that we're not specifying a protocol necessarily. We're not even to that point. The next step is once we grant a problem, once we get a working group, we talk about what are the requirements. But technically, if we're using MLS, we need the MLS clients on whatever service we're interoperating with to have sort of a cohesive and we need to have an intersecting set of policies. And so the clients, for example, if to give you a simple example, when I remove myself from a group, I send a proposal to remove myself. Someone needs to commit that proposal. Whose responsibility
Right.
is to do that? We need to have interoperability.
Yeah.
That when there's a policy that, okay, in this particular group that's done this way, then the clients need to comply with that.
Okay, so I think what I'm hearing is we don't know yet, but there's a strong preference to use the MLS architecture as a basis, and that will drive some of the decisions as opposed to with respect to what gets done first.
Yeah.
Cool. I don't want to do the whole I don't want to do the whole discussion. That was the thing that I needed to clarify. So I'll sit down.
Okay.
AJ?
Hey, Rowan, thanks for giving this presentation. Definitely kind of clears up a lot of the space that we're looking at. I was hoping to clarify the introduction, identifying individuals inside of these different groups by different protocols, because I think the initial urge is to go for something that we've seen in like an email client where there's some sort of identifier, like, this is some user and we've got some contact system that finds these internal identifiers at system or service of their choice. I guess the difficulty, what is the thought behind, we're not talking to the service to route us to this user. We just need to identify their device individually. And that message gets delivered straight to them. That, device's identity by IP address or where it sits in the network is going to be tough to tease out with some sort of authority in the middle that directs us to them. And trying to solve that end to end versus centralizing it is going to be difficult.
Okay, so AJ, if I understand your concern, it's that you want to make sure that that whatever identifier is used, that it can ultimately provides enough information to route to the end clients.
Yeah, wherever that is, especially even if they're not online, which can
Yeah.
change over time.
Yeah, and for my affiliation, my employer is very, is obviously implements this as this is part of our product. So that's I'm not at all concerned that we will have a problem doing that.
Okay. You think that will be implemented to find a user? It's by their service that they're using for this message.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, great.
It would be the service's responsibility to deliver it to them later if they're not online.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Matthew?
Hi. Thinking about the introduction problem, I realized that we might be missing something from the scope here, which is giving the users the ability to basically opt in or out of whether they are being linked through to other services at all. And there could be a massive dystopia if Mimi gets this wrong, a bit like GDPR cookie acceptance pop-ups everywhere, where users might be on Signal, and say we're in the future when we're in a group chat, and then somebody wants to bring somebody on WhatsApp into that group. And everybody says, hell no, the whole reason we're on Signal is to stop Facebook getting at our data or whatever. You need to have some kind of semantics, both at the API and frankly the UX layer, to make sure that people can control the metadata privacy within a given conversation. So I basically wanted to flag up whether that was consciously being descoped or whether it had been missed, because if we don't consider it from the outset, it feels like something we could get horribly wrong.
Do you think you could rephrase the problem?
So the problem
in one sentence
is users should be able to select where their conversations are getting interoperated with, so that they can maintain their own metadata footprint. And we need to support that in MIMI.
Okay, so if I can rephrase it, it's not that the user can do something, that the user has a certain set of policies that their service requires about metadata, and that policy is enforced. Or if it's not, that the user is informed.
Yes, albeit on a kind of conversation by conversation basis.
Okay. I think that the current text actually covers that.
Phone's ringing, dude.
Is that a robocall? Was that a robocall? I said.
That was the DMA call.
So yeah, I think that the current text actually covers that under in the introduction paragraph. There is some text about that, but do you want to cover that when we actually look over the text?
If you could, between now and when we start talking about the charter, look, there's a line in the charter about respecting expressed user preferences about reachability and discoverability, and see if you think it captures this bit as well about kind of where the metadata is located.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Eric.
Eric. Yeah, I mean, I would expect in this case, since people are to decide who gets to join a group, you could be like, I don't like people who have, at WhatsApp and that's.com in the back. So I want to talk about the introduction problem just a minute and try to sharpen up, I think, what the requirements are. So it seems to me there are 3 layers of requirements, of things you might imagine doing, right? At the very top, the sort of most powerful would be to say that, you could have, I think what Jonathan's draft calls service-specific identifiers, things like, unqualified names like @Ecker, and be able to figure out like which service they were on. That's what I expect, or IETF115 numbers, what Spin tries to do. The sort of next level down, which I think you're trying to roll out of scope. The next level down is to be able to have, whether they're hidden or unhidden qualified identifiers in the same, like RFC 22 names. And the idea would be, so, it might be the case, so now the interfaces might be presented as, as EKR at wire, but like theoretically, but the point would be that, that given those things, there's an unambiguous way to figure out exactly what services that requires connecting to, right?
For the internal identifiers.
Yeah. So if I'm given an internal identifier and the scoping parameter, this is what service is on. So I mean, I guess so an email, like in an email system, right? You can imagine. I mean, email names are one giant string, but you can imagine them being done this way. You imagine saying, EKR and then example.com as like the identifier. And my point is, there's a single algorithm you follow to figure out where that server lives, right? And then there's like, and then there's like an even worse thing, which is that you have to maintain a table that is not like generically lookupable, that tells you WhatsApp is over here and Signal's over here, and in fact, like, there's different things you have to do to connect each of them. I assume that we want the middle one, not the last one, right? That is, there's a single set of algorithms and communication protocols that do not require you to maintain a specialized table for each kind of party service.
So I think that in terms of the problem statement, I don't think we need to decide that. I think that's a requirements question. But I think that is when presented specifically, explicitly, I think that the logical conclusion will be fairly obvious for that question.
I would hope so. I'm just trying to okay, so I'm happy to defer this conversation, but I think that it is part of, I think that seems to be part of the problem. Otherwise, we don't get very far. So I think So I think, yeah, I'll defer other comments to the requirements.
Jim?
Hi, Jim Fenton. I've got a slew of questions about identifiers that I'm not going to ask now because I think we're covering that pretty well. The thing that confused me was toward the end, you were talking about the need to understand what service a particular user uses. Are they on Wire, or are they on Signal, or are they on WhatsApp, or what, et cetera. What confuses me is that if these services are, become interoperable through this, why do you need to know? They interoperate.
So if I have a friend who only has an account on Mastodon,
Okay.
then I need, I need to somehow, I can't just, I need to be able to, and if I'm not using that system, I need to be able to provide some information so that I can start the process and start routing messages, send my user introduction to the correct service to start the ball rolling.
So maybe my confusion is that you're saying the system needs to understand that. That isn't the concern of the users anymore then. Is it the user or the system that needs to understand what services?
So the second problem is that if you have, let's say, that something to search on, like an email address or a phone number or a full name and some other information, say, that you could optionally, with the target user's consent, that you could use that to figure out, here are some services that I'm on and sort of the preferred order of them. Like, and I'm not trying to be specific about how you would do that. There are a lot of privacy issues, blah, 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 blah. But if that system existed, you could check it. If the person you were trying to contact agreed to publish information on that system, then you could go and say, I know they're on Mastodon. I'm going to try this user on Mastodon. The first problem is that if I explicitly said, yeah, I want to contact Raphael on Signal with this identifier, that even though I'm not using a Signal client, that I would be able to contact and interoperate with Raphael on Signal.
I guess my question then is, do you have to say you want to contact Raphael on Signal, or do you just say I want to contact Raphael in the system?
The two things on that slide, the first one is I need to say Raphael and I'm contacting him on Signal. The second one is that there could be a service that I could ask, what services does Raphael have? What service does Raphael prefer to be contacted on?
Okay, I've just confirmed that this is a point of contention, and so
Yeah,
thank you.
Cool. Yeah, I think for the purposes of the problem statement, the problem is being stated as functionally you have a target identifier, and what you need to be able to do is bootstrap a communication with that identifier on their service. And the area that needs to be explored in the design space is around, how do you do that? Is it at the user level or the system level? Does it leverage, some side service on the side to help you do that? Those are like questions about the solution as opposed to the problem. Yeah.
Ben, you're up. Ben Campbell. So Rowan, I apologize because I've already asked you this, but I was going to ask it in the bigger group. Notably absent on your list of example identifiers were telephone numbers. So
no, the phone number was
the
second item on the slide.
It was on the slide. It wasn't
was
in
on
the
the slide
identity.
on the radio
Was it
slide.
in the identity draft?
It was in the problem statement, and it was in the problem statement and in the it was in the problem statement.
Okay, I completely missed that, so I apologize. You can say something
Thanks,
about it if
Ben.
you want to, but you don't have to.
So we're going to be closing the queue for clarifying questions momentarily. So if you need to get in it, please do so now.
Hello, Hans-Jörg Happel. I understood, so this is basically about interoperability driven by the Digital Markets Act and, you know, the desire to make clients interoperable. So my question would be, does it also include in a way a portability according to the GDPR Article 20? Because the reason I ask is I think there is quite some overlap, for instance, in the data model and so on, but there might be subtle differences as well to think about. So just to illustrate that a little bit, in my observation is that in many IETF protocols, for instance, like the calendaring invite RFCs, in the initial design, they are much more focused on interoperability. But you have problems later on with portability. For instance, you had these invites or receipts you sent on an invite to a certain user when you invite to an event, which is fine for live interoperability. But if you later on, like 10 years later or so, move people away to another provider, you want to pod the data, but you don't want to resend those invites. So you have a certain class of a problem which doesn't occur in live interoperability, but is portability relevant. And I wonder if this is also supposed to be in the scope of the proposal and of the working group.
So I'm just going to go out on a limb here and say, I think that's an interesting problem to solve, but I don't think it's in scope, and it's, by my read, it's not required by the DMA.
Yeah, but by something like GDPR. So the question would be, is it mainly DMA driven, or?
So it's whether it's required to be done in an interoperable way.
Okay.
I don't see any regulatory requirement to do that. Interesting problem.
Okay.
Not currently what I'm considering as part of this scope. We got a big scope right now, so.
All right. Thank you.
Harold?
Harald Alvestrand. An elephant just wandered through the room in my head. Presence. This proposal never talks about presence. And every single messaging system I've dealt with has a support for presence. And every single messaging system I've been involved with on the server side has had major scaling problems because of presence. So is this something that you really want to leave out of scope, or is this something we need to have a deep architectural discussion about?
You can give your opinion.
You're entitled to your opinion. That if your opinion is that we need to have it, that's your opinion. We could ask.
What's Rowan's opinion?
My opinion is that most people ignore it now because it wasn't implemented very well in most messaging systems.
Do you want to follow up there, Harold, or are you good?
Okay, I was pointed out that SMS and iMessage doesn't have a presence. I have not used those for those things. So I think we need to consider this and either rule it totally out of scope or architect our solutions to support it.
So, in the presentation, I saw mention of end-to-end security, and just encrypting the messages is not end-to-end security. Not unless you've got end-to-end security of the keys. Right. And I think it's important to make that point, because if I exchange my contact information with Alyssa, it makes a huge difference. If I've got Alyssa's public key in my contact book, I can then have end-to-end security. If I'm going off to Wignall or whatever, and that is where the mapping takes place from @Alyssa to her public key, I do not have end-to-end security. And that's a place where you can have a rubber hose attack or a whatever. And so that's one point. The other point is that looking through all these presentations, it appears that there is an assumption here that what you're going to build is a series of gateways, because of course you've all got these large infrastructures, and you think that the easiest way of going from where you are to where you want to be is going to gate each of the 10 messaging infrastructures to each other. And we actually have a data point that tells us that's not stable, because I remember the days when before SMTP dominated, where I used to have to send my mail through different gateways. And the reason we went from that model to a common protocol was it was just too much to maintain. And so I understand that we're going to go and charter with the assumption that we're going to do a gateway. But by the time we actually read out, I assure you we will all be using a common protocol, because that's going to be the easiest way.
Okay, so before you sit down, PHP, I take it that you are in full support of the end-to-end identity being part of the problem statement from your comments. And one thing that I didn't mention in that slide is that there is no. I've been careful when working on that part to try to make it clear that there are a lot of people who want to have sort of a hierarchical PKI style way of doing that. And we need to sort of leave the door open for things like a, just like a mesh based way of making these kind of assertions.
Yeah, one caveat there. I want to have end-to-end public key. Yeah. When people use the term identity, that's almost as bad as Web3 for me. Because, it's one of those terms that when somebody uses it, I have absolutely no idea what they mean by it. And it tends to be a weasel word that allows us to do the shuffle from, so I want to stick to my public keys because I know what that gives me in security world. Whereas if somebody says identity, well, now I've got a fluffy cloud and somebody can take away my strong public key-based identity and stick a marshmallow in place. And then I don't have end-to-end security. I have end-to-end fluffy.
Okay. Look forward to getting some. Yeah.
Yes. Jonathan.
All right. Jonathan Rosenberg, 5'9". So I mostly wanted to offer clarifying response to some of the folks at the mic. I think there's a little confusion on this, perhaps. The focus of this group, I believe, is not to build a whole suite of things that someone could go implement a new client and build a new service around, and we're going to design the new protocol for how one would build a chat system from scratch. I mean, maybe that's a side effect, but that's not the objective. The problem we're trying to solve is that there are existing messaging providers that already have servers that they have, and they have clients that they have.
With billions of users.
Billions of users. And we may be asking them to make changes, by the way, but we are starting with the assumption that they exist, and our goal is to interoperate and federate them. So fundamentally, that is a server-to-server protocol, with the big important exception that because of end-to-end encryption and end-to-end identity that comes along for the ride, I think most of us here working on this stuff understand that without end-to-end identity, end-to-end encryption is fluffy. So there will be consequentially pushing of, see what I did there? There'll be pushing of requirements into those systems for implementation of protocols like MLS and the associated end-to-end identity. But fundamentally, we're building a server-to-server thing here, and we're specifying those interfaces in this working group. That's what I wanted to be clear we're doing. So if things, for example, like Harold, like let's worry about the scale of presence systems. Scale of presence systems is a big deal for the people who are implementing them. We're not trying to specify a protocol for them on how to build it. They already have something. We have to decide only whether or not we want presence messages to be exchanged between these providers. And that's work I believe we'll do in the working group, where we define that minimal viable message format and whether there's a presence message or not. So I think it's, in that sense, it's quite a simpler problem on the wire. See what I did there? For getting these things implemented. So that's my clarifying, hopefully, commentary.
Thank you. Colin.
Since there's been confusion on it, I just wanted to clarify that my understanding of this with phone numbers definitely in scope, and the desirable user experience is if I had somebody else's phone number, I'd have a chance of being able to connect and have communication with them if they wanted to. And that from a sort of requirements point of view, that was, that's what we were trying to hit. We weren't I felt we got way too deep in the weeds of possible implementations of ways that you could achieve that user experience about whether it required servers in the cloud or whether you had to know which service the person's on. I mean, a fundamental characteristics for me is I do not want to know which service, I don't want to have to know which service somebody is on to be able to connect to them. If all I know is their phone number, I want to be able to connect to them. So I want to make sure that from a requirements point of view, we view that as one of the things we're trying to achieve.
We need to make sure we get clarity on this point.
I suggest we look at we wait
Let's
until we
look
get
at
to the
the
charter
charter.
wording.
Fair.
Yeah, there's been a lot of discussion of this already. Yours.
Joris Baum. So just one point that triggered me was you had one slide where you mentioned you want to prevent impersonation. And because of my daily business, I'm kind of more maybe like that something that's often overlooked with this aspect is that there are some use cases where impersonation is actually desirable. For example, the business use case where you have like an admin and you want to impersonate a certain user. And I just wanted to raise awareness that there might be use cases out there where this is actually an important feature. But as far as I understand, usually that's more concerning long-term storage and not what you're talking about. I just wanted to double check, basically.
Yeah, I wouldn't use the term impersonation for that. I would use the term delegation.
Oh yeah, okay. Makes sense. Thanks.
Antoine.
Hello, Antoine Sanko. I wanted to have a clarification on the view you have on interoperability. Do you mean that you want to specify a minimal least common denominator among the different systems that implement instant messaging, or do you want to provide a way for external systems that don't support a specific additional feature that you have on a given system, so users from the outside world of your network can provide a way to an information that mimics this feature so the experience in your network is consistent?
I'm not sure I understood your second option. So I'll sort of give an answer and then you can tell me whether that answers your question. I want to be able to send an instant message to people on that currently are on multiple different services. And I'd like them to be able to reply and be able to send me, cat pictures and so on.
So for instance, I will give a very stupid example from the beginning of the 2000s. If I want to whiz someone on something like Messenger.
Sorry, you said
do you have an external
reach?
API?
I didn't catch the word reach, you said?
Whiz, to have a way to shake the window, for instance, a given feature. And it's not in the minimal interoperability message. Do you want that your system provides an API so external user can mimic this feature, or it's?
So the goal is we would have a discussion about requirements. And so if you want to, if like having rings or knocks or window vibrations is a feature on some systems, and that happens to not make the cut in terms of the common interoperable feature set, that people who use whatever proprietary format they currently use can still do that. And if I'm in a group that doesn't do that, I would not be able to do that, but I would still be able to do all of the things that are in the common feature set.
Okay.
That's personally my goal.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. You can, now you get to go. Thanks, Ron. So we're gonna switch to the charter discussion. Yeah.
So there was some discussion just now. Let me get the slides in a bit. There was some discussion about whether particular requirements are present here. Think in terms of whether you want this group to decide requirements or you want it to be locked into the charter. And that distinction for those of you who are not used to this process is, do you want the entire IETF on board with this before we start, or do you want this group deciding it? The former is the chartering process. The latter is this group coming to requirements. So make sure that the charter is clear enough for you that you think the requirements will be addressed by the group. Don't try and convince the IETF that they have to be on board with exactly what requirement you're talking about. Is that a reasonable distinction? All right, let me, we do have slides up, yay. Why don't I see what's on that presentation? Charter.
Can you open it?
Yeah, let me, well, that's always fun. Let me get the charter up on my screen. I guess I'm sharing screen.
Yep.
Yes.
So in the time it takes us to display the charter, people can find it themselves and re-familiarize yourself or read it for the first time. It's linked from the slides and it's been on the mailing list.
It really says it's coming up here.
I think we should charter the working group about the screen share being started.
Here we go.
And I think we would have the experts in the room from Meet Echo to help us. There we go. Okay.
Give it a second to refresh. Damn network people.
Okay, now you get 2 more minutes of awkward silence to read the charter. I'm not going to read it.
Gesundheit.
I'm going to scroll.
Yeah. How far do I want to scroll?
That's probably good.
Yeah, that's probably good. Hi, Ted.
Can you scroll one more? Thanks. Oh, eventually it'll update. So we have a couple of open PRs that hit on at least one of the topics we've already discussed. So my inclination is to start with those, if that's okay. But if you have comments that you feel need to be addressed before we do that, we can take them now.
He's thinking.
Ted Hardy, clarifying question. How do you mean take the PRs? Do you want to discuss the PRs or just?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So yeah, what I want to talk about isn't in any of the PRs. So if you want to do that, I suggest you close the queue, kick us all out, and we start again.
Okay. I'll just lock it. Although, well, that's not going to work. Yeah. Okay.
So I'm Rafael. Okay. My question was going to be about the PRs.
Okay, one sec. So
Let's get
why don't we
PR
go
up.
to
Yeah.
the first one? Yeah.
Okay.
Is
No.
that one still open?
Yeah, it was.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
So, but this one, yes.
Yeah, I thought, oh, I see. Okay. No, just start with the first one. The first one is really easy.
Okay. Oh, it is marked closed.
Yeah, okay. So, so this one related to the language about how this working group will not be specifying new signaling protocols. I think there was some confusion about this term signaling protocols. I think when the charter was written, it was meant to imply audio and video signaling specifically, but it was not clear in the context of the paragraph that was the limitation on it. So I actually made an edit already to the charter that was just flashed up, such that this is now clear that it's only about audio and video signaling. So if people still have concerns, we should talk about it, but I think this one has been addressed. Yes, we got a thumbs up in the room. Anybody joining the queue to talk about that? Good. No. Okay, so I think that one is taken care of. So the next one is around federation and message delivery text added by Raphael, and there's been some discussion of this one on the PR. Raphael, did you want to come talk about it?
Yeah, it started from a discussion on the list, and then there was some discussion on the PR, and then on the list again. So I think all the concerns have been addressed, from what it looks like on that one. But if there are any questions, happy to answer.
So does that include the new suggestion about the text that avoids centralized control over conversations?
I think that was cleared on list.
Okay.
Matthew?
It was clear on the list, but it should be incorporated in the wording of the PR.
Can you come to the mic? Sorry.
Yeah, it's clear on the discussion on the list, but should we backport that into the wording on the PR? Because the PR is currently saying, where was there a minute ago? Here we are. The PR was saying that it specifically requires ordering of handshake messages within groups. You are explaining that can be done in a decentralized fashion, or at least shared between the participants, whereas that isn't clear here, or at least it wasn't to.
Yeah, I think there's some confusion around the terminology on that. So what I'm referencing is the architecture document. And that gives these two options, and the PR is not specific about either one. So okay. I think the language in the PR is generic in that sense.
State your name, Matthew.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Matthew, state your name.
Matthew Hodgson from Matrix.
Rowan?
So at the beginning of this discussion, Pete said, do you want the IETF to discuss this, or do you want us to discuss this? I think this is a clear case where the intention we've discussed in this room, we've discussed among the main parties, we agree. But adding more text, this is going to be a red flag for the IETF. It's going to cause confusion. I think that this will hold up chartering. So I think the original wording that Raphael proposed is fine and incorporates what we need. I think as soon as we add avoid centralized control over, then it's going to open up a whole can of worms. We're going to have a discussion at the IETF. Instead, I think we should have a discussion about, what are the requirements in the working group once the working group is formed.
Thanks, Rowan. Then we have Eric.
Yeah, I want to speak to that same point. I agree with Rowan. Like this is like classic overspecification of the charter, and we should the Raphael's text looks like reasonable to me. I may wordsmith it at some point later, but it generally looks fine. But I think that writing this text here is going to cause all kinds of problems, and I don't even know what it means. So let's just start there. So yeah, I don't think we should.
Are you okay with that?
Matthew, are you in the queue?
Yeah, sorry. Processing. If I can insert myself, do I have to press a button or can
No.
Go
ahead.
But say your name again so that everybody knows you're talking.
Sure, Matthew Hodgson from Matrix. I guess I may be missing some of the politics as to why it would become an IETF level concern if we discussed the idea that the ordering needs to or does not have to be done in a centralized fashion. Because at the moment, it really seems to imply here that it has to be centralized.
Where?
By talking about ordering of handshake messages within groups.
Why is that too centralized?
Okay, so the implication is that as long as there is some kind of ordering that could be done by a vector clock, or it could be done in the centralized. If everyone is happy,
That's why I read
doesn't
this.
imply centralization, then I'm happy.
Yeah, I don't think this applies centralization. If you think that if you have text that would, like, my problem is I mean, I generally agree with this. Like, I think the intent of this is, but I don't know quite what it actually means. And so I think if you want to just avoid, if you have suggestions that make this not prescribing centralized, you should make those suggestions. But I think trying to prescribe non-centralized is the problem here.
Okay, yeah, totally agree.
Okay, so you're fine with Raphael's original suggestion. Okay, great, thanks. And then we have one more.
Do we have an actual?
Yeah, can you look at the can you look at the diff? Yeah. Yeah. Just
There we go.
So this is the topic that we were just discussing earlier with the introduction problem. And the current suggestion here is to add text which indicates that the working group may investigate and develop a protocol to discover the target user's preferred application. So it's not decided that that is definitely going to happen, but it's offered as an option. Ted.
Ted Hardy, optimism enthusiast. So I really appreciate the optimism by which the proponents have brought forward the work in general, especially given our past history here. That's really cool and important. But I think the introduction problem text as it stands now, and even with the just disappeared PR.
Yeah.
Sorry, Pete, I was really going to refer to that. So even with that, the way it's currently written needs a complete rewrite, not a small change. Because the way it's currently written, it's a completely separable problem, right? You could gen up a working group that had as its goal solving the introduction problem across these services without a goal of creating interoperability among them. And I think that's not what you actually want. I think what you're trying to say is for the systems which have signed up to interoperate by implementing whatever MIMI comes up with, we will have a mechanism to allow introduction to occur. And the way it's written now sounds a lot broader than I think the minimal viable product would be here. So I suggest that this text actually get hacked a good bit more than the PR that's in there now to say, MIMI will consider developing a protocol to allow conformant services to provide a mechanism to introduce their subscribers across other conformant services. So I think that what we're trying to do here is actually much less ocean boiling than this sounds like. And I think for a charter to get through the rest of the process, we have to make it clear that we're only boiling the parts of the ocean that have deliberately dug the canals we specify.
So Rowan, it may be about to answer the question I'm going to ask here, but introduction and discovery seem like very different kinds of things. Do you see them, Ted, as intertwined, connected, the same, or are they two very different things?
Can I say that that's a problem for the working group and not the charter? Because I'd like to say that if you don't mind.
Okay, Rowan, how about you go take a shot?
Ted, how would you feel about the working group may investigate and develop a protocol for use with MIMI to discover the target user's preferred applications in which that target should be reached?
So I think for use with MIMI is less restrictive than what I proposed, and I would prefer something even more restrictive than that. But if the working group wants, if the charter discussion leads to your text, I will not fall upon a sword.
because again, it
Wait,
seems like
Ted, don't leave. Come back. Finish your thought.
Oh, I was just going to say that if we add those 4 words or whatever, then that becomes a requirements question for the working group, where I would certainly support you in saying, no, we're not going to use this protocol generically.
I'm sorry, I just missed the last 3 words of your utterance, if you wouldn't mind saying them again.
It becomes a requirements question that where I, for one, would help you in the working group say, no, we don't, it's not a requirement to make this work outside of MIMI.
Okay. I think we're close to convergence there, which is good news.
Wait, don't leave, because, sorry, just making people stand around at microphones. Sorry, Ted, I thought because what Rowan just spoke about is more to this additional sentence that he was adding, but I thought you were concerned about the prior sentence as well, where we say we're going to specify a solution to the introduction problem. That needs to be narrowed according to you, correct?
Yes, and I think that he was saying that the narrowing would occur in the working group by the discussion of ensuring that the requirements were focused only on MIMI compliant services. Okay.
Yes. Okay.
Then I think I have an action item to raise an issue and propose a PR.
Yes.
But I hope that the general question of how we ensure that this does not become the ocean boiling question of solving the introduction problem for people who haven't signed up for MIMI leaves the charter one way or the other, whether you take my PR or somebody else.
Got it. Thank you. Eric.
So I don't want to worry too much of charter text at this exact moment and try to scope out the problem space instead for a second. As Pete says, it seems to me there are 2 problems. One problem is, given an identifier and the service it is on, arranging to connect A to B. And we can call it introduction if we want. We can call it Schmidt introduction if we want. I don't care. And then separately, as Pete says, there's a discovery problem, which is given an identifier that is not qualified by service, determining which services it might or not be on. And I believe there is consensus that the first problem needs to be solved or the whole thing falls apart. And I believe that there is dissent about the second problem needs to be solved. So I see Jonathan nodding, so I think I've accurately characterized this. I personally would like to solve the second problem, but I can live with text, which makes that a working position. So I guess what I would say is, without looking, pretending this PR did not exist, do people agree with that framing? Because if they agree with that framing, I think we can construct text that will make that happen.
Colin.
Colin Jakes. I think Ecker, as usual, has got exactly the right framing, and I want to focus just in on the discovery part, which is I want to make sure that it is an option for the working group to decide if they can solve that or not. They may find it's an impossible problem to solve, or they may solve it. But I do not want to continue to insert these words in there that it's a new protocol that we'd have to do this, because I think the best solutions don't involve a protocol at all. And so I would rather not keep embedding Rowan's solution into the charter text on this, right? So I don't like that.
Are you okay with
Sorry.
I just want to discuss the problem to be solved. I don't want to, it does not need any discussion of how it's solved, right?
I see. Okay. Thanks. Phil.
So a general question, point, throughout the charter, at some points the term identity is used, and at other points we have user identifier. They both appear to be meaning the same thing. I'd like to propose that we use user identifier throughout and Nick's identity, which is, looking at in the terms that it is being used, it is certainly being used to me as a user identifier. And my Twitter handle is not my identity.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, you got a good one. Nor is my public key. They are identifiers. The other thing is, I was going to wait a bit. If you look at the bits that we say are out of scope, the last one, the Oracle to do the user lookup, that statement appears to be saying we're not going to be doing what we're talking about doing here. If you, So
Yes, it's quite possible that well, obviously, this was just suggested as an edit to the charter, and the previous version did not contain this, and therefore it is ruled out of scope in the base text.
yeah, so I would like to just remove that Oracle line talking about the Oracle, because that is something that you're gonna need.
But so on the identity point, I think people should respond, because my understanding was that actually we do mean two different things when we say identifier and identity, and the identity is the cryptographic identity, and the identifier is whatever we're using on a particular service. So if people have opinions about that, please respond. Matthew.
On the PR list, I think you're missing one. There's number 7, which I submitted earlier, based on the earlier question, if you can refresh.
I will refresh.
Unless GitHub is having some kind of consistency meltdown, which is a trivial one, just suggesting that we explicitly put data metadata permissions in scope. Yeah, that one there, 22 minutes ago.
Which one?
Top one. Oh, number 7. Oh, well, it was opened during the
sorry.
the BOF. Okay, all right. But can we finish? I would like to finish on number 4. So, are we finished on number 4? Does anyone have anything else to say on number 4? Are you in the queue? Yes, you are in the queue next.
I am, but I was doing this intentionally, trying to be at the end of the number 4 discussion. It is kind of a broader point about this passage, but not about the specific PR. So, I mean, when I read this, I still think there's a bit of tension in the way the charter is structured, which I'm sure we'll resolve. I think this is a simple one. Between that last sentence, that express user preferences about discoverability and reachability must be respected. Insofar as I suspect a lot of messaging systems have properties that preclude, in certain cases, discoverability and reachability as a feature that were not expressly preferences of the user, but are part of the reason why the users use the service. So in other words, I'm talking entirely about, social media style messaging systems where you curate very carefully the set of people that you're supposed to be in contact with. And this interacts a lot with both the introduction problem and with the question of the degree to which spam mitigation is actually in scope of this or not. So I guess the only question I had about this, and I wanted to do this because we have this PR open, does it have to be express user preferences, or is it properties of the systems?
The text says, to paraphrase, any preference that is expressed must be respected.
Now, I read express user preferences to mean I had to say intentionally, I don't want to be discovered. And we have to respect that. And of course, we should respect that. But I guess I am hypothesizing there are actually a lot of properties of common systems that have an introduction problem that users don't have to press a button to say that. But the reason why they're on the service is because it has that property. So it's not like I expressed it. It's not an express user preference. It is an innate preference.
But I guess what I'm saying is the sentence that's in the charter here is the inverse of that. It's saying if the user does express it, that must be respected.
Yeah.
For anything that's not expressed, it doesn't say anything one way or the other.
The issue is later the charter says everything that's concerned with spam and abuse, we're kicking down the can. We may do it, but a lot of it is out of scope. It's metadata analysis. And I, in fact, think the main way those systems mitigate spam is through things users don't express as preferences. So that's why I was asking if that we could maybe tweak that. But I don't want to take the entire working group's time on this, if this is a complicated one.
No, I think this is a good point. We have to figure out how to capture that, because I don't think, it's sort of it's both express and implied.
Yep.
But that's not a great
Anyway,
way to
I
do
just
it
wanted to
anyway.
stick this in because this was up, and I know we've got other things to discuss, but okay.
Okay.
Express and implied sounds great to me, Alyssa.
Okay, maybe we can try that. Okay,
Thank you.
okay. Peter.
Hi, Peter Castleman. On the identity point, I think there's a difference between an identifier of an individual in the system, some kind of handle, a number, But there's also other identity attributes that we're going to have to deal with, things like display names, organizations. There's other aspects of identity that we will want to convey. So I think it's useful to maybe distinguish, but I don't think you can sort of copy and replace or just talk about the identifier. There is going to be other identity considerations as well.
Thank you. Rowan?
I was just going to say, I think we have some specific texts that it seems like people are happy with for different problems with this PR, which I'm happy to write. And I would have already uploaded to GitHub as a change to this PR, but I can't get to GitHub right now.
Okay. Well, Ted also has an action to work on this, so.
So as it happens, I can
Eric.
get to GitHub, and I just filed PR number 10, which I think tries to enact what I said earlier, and I hope people will be happy with. I'm not suggesting necessarily people accept that now, but you take a look. It also has an implied as a separate.
Okay. Thank you.
So I just have a bit of a clarifying question here. So I'm kind of following and getting up to speed. There was a question from Eric to say, is discovery in or out? And I'm listening to the discussion about identifiers and identity. And I kind of think they're the same question. If we say identity is me, but I have identifiers in different systems, does that open the question of how does Eric speak to me and discover which identifier to use, which will get to me out of the many identifiers I have that identify my identity? Too many idents in that sentence, I apologize. And should it therefore be pushed out of scope if discovery is out of scope, or absolutely addressed within the charter if we are doing discovery? That's my open question.
So there's obvious dependencies depending on like which cell in the matrix we end up in here. So the charter needs to ultimately be internally consistent, that's for sure, if that's kind of your point.
I think the answer to what's in the charter is it should, what I'm hearing is it should allow this group to take on the discoverability question, but not require it. That the group will decide once up and running whether they're taking on discoverability and examine that problem, see if they can address it.
David?
Hello, I'm David Vanek. I had a quick thing on the deferring, and this might not be the correct time for this, and if it's not the correct time for it, please tell me, but deferring the whole spam and abuse problem till later.
Yeah, why don't we just try to close up on discovery versus introduction and then come to it? I'm sure people want to talk about that. So are others in the queue to continue discussing discovery and introduction? Yes, you are, Eric, you're next.
I think just briefly, maybe I am, but we will in fact need to like clarify, get some terminology straight about like keying material versus like names versus like real names. Jonathan Rosenberg's draft does quite a nice job actually of trying to build a taxonomy of the various things. So I think like that's something we can do offline. We can make a pass through and like use either terminology from there or somewhere else to try to cut those apart, right? And I certainly agree with PHV's point that like the public keys and names, identifiers are all different things, but I think that's something we can actually do offline. Because I don't think there's actually disagreement about it. I just think it's like the writing needs some.
Thanks. Phil?
This might be a point where looking back to the EU thing might actually help us in that what is the EU asking us to do? They're not asking us to provide a mechanism that allows me to sit at my keyboard and find Pete Resnick. What they're asking us to do is to have a mechanism that if I'm already in contact with Pete, they want me to have a mechanism that allows Pete to send an identifier to me that I can input into a chat client that allows me to talk to Pete, even though we're using different service providers. Now, that is a discovery problem, but it is a much more narrowly constrained discovery problem than the broad one that we've been expanding it out to. And in IETF terms, that is something that for me comes back to URIs, because the whole idea of URIs is a uniform identifier space that you can map any form of identifier onto, so that you can cut and paste them between people. So that's the sort of thing that I would suggest we look at.
So I would say that because half of that sounded like a requirements discussion and half of it sounded like a potential charter item discussion. And I guess I'd ask you to hammer out or bang on the charter text to see if it would allow for the group to come to that conclusion. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, yeah, I thought that you were going to come back and say, well, I don't want to talk to you.
No. Would have been a good answer. Mallory.
Mallory Nodal, Center for Democracy and Technology. My comment is similar to PHB's in that this is not the interoperable identity BOF. This is should really, really narrowly be scoped, both charter and requirements, to make sure that identity is in service of the messaging. And now I understand, because I was a real proponent of keeping discoverability in this on the list previously, and now I understand why people didn't want it, because I think it gets us to this point where we are building interoperability or interoperable identity, which would be a total disaster, and I don't think we want that. So if there's a way we can both in the charter and requirements, every time identity or identifiers are mentioned, making sure that it's within the service of the messaging piece.
Yeah, sounds good. I'm gonna close the queue for this topic in a minute. So if you have anything else to say on this topic, please join the queue. Matthew.
I just want to go back to the metadata residency thing on PR7, if just to make sure it doesn't get dropped off the charter, or at least gives a few minutes for people to say whether it's an appropriate thing to add in.
Yes, we will come. We will come.
Oh, we
to
will.
it.
Okay, sorry,
Yeah,
just a
yeah,
second.
sorry, we're
Go
just
on.
like trying to close off this one. Yeah. Harold.
Hello, John. Just the words application and service are used in this charter in a way that sometimes seems to make them mean the same thing and sometimes make them seem different. Both terms are undefined. I think we should use only one term for one thing and define them carefully. Probably, since this seems to be focusing on a gatewaying problem, we should use service throughout.
Thanks. Good point. Rowan, are you in the queue still?
Rowan, would you like?
Are you in the queue or are you done?
I just wanted to say regarding the PR number 10, I am very happy with this text, and I'm happily, if people are happy with this, I'm happy to remove PR number 4 and close it. Do we want to take a hum or something on this, or?
So I think Ted maybe needs to look at it based on his earlier comment, unless you've done that already and you feel comfortable, but.
I don't think we do. I put in a PR that claimed it didn't have a merge conflict. Oh, maybe it's because I didn't base on yours. Yeah. Okay. So we need to rebase, but I think that there shouldn't be a major problem in resolving that. Conceptually
Okay.
fine. So there may be a rebase problem there, but as I was doing it while trying to listen to the conversation. And
Yeah, it's a little hard to multitask. So I think we're in a good place with this item. We can kind of resolve the final differences immediately after the buff and take it that way. I don't think we need to decide on specific words at the moment. Give people a little time to look at the PRs. So I'm going to unlock the queue, and I think we should come to PR number 7.
Yep.
And then we'll come back around to spam and anything else people want to talk about.
Rowan, are you actually in the queue?
We can remove him. There you go.
Yeah, let's see 7.
There's 7. Well, as soon as the screen refreshes.
So I commented this. I think this is overspecification in the charter. Like, I understand the motivation, but like, this is like one in many requirements one might think would be desirable, but it's not like actually that core to what's actually happening here, and I think that it should not be in the charter. I mean, like, if we're gonna like add every property that like would be good to the charter, we're gonna be here for a very, very long time.
Raphael.
Yeah, I think I agree with that in the sense that metadata has not been introduced as a term so far, and this is oddly specific while also introducing metadata. So yeah, I agree with what Ekos said. If you want to talk about metadata, we would have to do something more comprehensive, but there is no PR for that.
Jonathan.
Jonathan Rosenberg. I think the express and implied preferences language that we already have in the charter gives the working group the room to sort out the details on these things and is sufficient. So I agree. I don't think this is needed in the charter. I think it's a fabulous discussion for the working group.
Anyone else want to express an opinion? Okay, so it sounds like if we add implied, people are comfortable. Oh, we have Brendan.
My PR has that, by the way.
Okay.
Brendan Moran, I think that the data residency is an incredibly important problem, and the metadata residency, I'd prefer to have it in there.
Okay, Mallory.
Mallory Nodal, CDT. I wanted to put on mic something that Nick Doty said in the chat, which is really smart, to just remove the word express and just say user preferences rather than adding implied. But this is not exactly about this. I tend to agree with others that we don't need to introduce the metadata if it's not mentioned anywhere else in the charter. But because Ecker and others brought up just that word again, I wanted to offer that alternative.
So can you stay for a minute? So you don't think that user preferences implies expression?
No, actually, I think that user preferences. So back to the conversation before, I didn't come on mic then because I felt others were handling it rather well. But my reaction to it was, you actually need to ask now. So the implied piece, I think, means that we're not okay with it being implied anymore. We actually do need to confront and make visible these implied preferences somehow now. And so what are user preferences that are now implied that must be expressed, and shift this so that interoperability works. And I don't think it's okay to work based on implied user preferences because we don't know what they are, and there's no way for users to feedback then. So that's a problem that has to be solved in the context of this working group. It doesn't have to be in the charter. So if you remove express, you just talk about user preferences. It's something we have to address in the working group. We can figure out how to make implied user preferences more expressed user preferences, and then deal with the expressed user preferences and respecting those, if that makes sense.
Okay, thanks. Vittorio?
Yeah, getting back to the data residency wording, I think that maybe data residency is a bit too specific, but I would be in favor of keeping a reference to something a little more generic, like data processing, meaning that when you introduce and you join the federation, then you must keep the principle that it's the user that decides where the data can or cannot go, which is the basic principle of the European privacy laws anyway. So the point is that, that there should be a way for the user to say, I want my data to go there or not to really go there, or just authorize them.
Thank you. John?
Yeah, I think we might need to take this user preferences thing to the list, because I think this is a lot thornier. Because again, I think, especially because this is in a paragraph about the introduction problem. The introduction problem you know, it has been conditioned for us all by the way that social media networks operate and the way that people curate lists of friends and things that are similar to that, that are properties of the system, that are fundamental underlying design choices that users don't have a say in, right? And like the fact that people like these properties of these systems and can choose ones that have an open front door where like anybody can message you, the way anyone, if you have a telephone number, can like hit you at a telephone number. There's nothing you can do about it. Social media has fundamentally altered this dynamic. And to put this as a way that, well, you know, we need to like confront users to get them to like express that that is what they actually want, I think is unrealistic, and it is really orthogonal to the problem we're trying to solve. So can we maybe punt this one? Because this needs more discussion.
So, John, before you disappear, is your suggestion that we get rid of the sentence in the charter and have the working group so chartered discuss how to do it, or you want the list to discuss more what to put in the charter about this?
I fear it is getting the list to discuss more what to put in the charter about this, because I think there is an unfortunate interaction between solving the introduction problem, putting spam out of scope, and having the statement about, nonetheless, we want to, you know, respect user preferences, right? And I believe those user preferences are tacit in every way that makes the introduction problem a problem at all. Like there is no introduction problem for a telephone number. If you got a telephone number, anybody can call it, right? It's the systems where you don't have a front door like that, that are designed to prevent that, that necessitate an introduction problem. And it is one of the reasons those are successful is because of the implications of that for spam and abuse. And suggesting that like this needs to be express user preferences is where this came from. And that's why I was like, okay, express it or implied, because it is implied by voting with your feet when you go to a social network messaging system that you do not want to have an open front door.
So yeah, I'm gonna contradict myself from 20 minutes ago. Maybe. Do you not envision, given the fact that all of the closed systems offer controls, that's where this came from in the first place, right? If you're all of a sudden going to open up a closed system to people from other non-closed systems who can reach you, that if you are already in a position where you're controlling who can reach you, that better extend to this much larger interoperable system, right? So do you not envision that the services that already offer such controls will not augment those controls with, hey, now people from Signal can reach you. Are you okay with that? Like that, and that's why I think, I mean, Mallory's point is perhaps that whatever's implicit today will have to become explicit, because the users who signed up for these services, that's why they're there in the first place, is because they have those controls. So why would these, like, we can't make these services offer those controls, but like, don't you anticipate that they will come to exist anyway?
It is the former point that we can't force these systems to make users make this choice, right? And to put it explicitly to them as a choice. Like if I thought Facebook was gonna give me a button I could push that said, I'm an open front door, like anybody can send, I don't require anything for anybody to see anything, right? I mean, maybe public posting is like that. Or, you know, maybe there are systems for like DMs in Twitter where you can like set that and receive DMs from anyone. Those are examples of ways that that could be made explicit. My point is, if the default of these things and the way that the reason they have been successful as communication systems is because they do not, their default out of the box behavior is to prevent users from having these, you know, like that open front door. I don't want to suggest we now need to force any system that is going to be compliant with MIMI to make people make that explicit express user preference, like identified before they can participate in the system. This is, again, we need to take this list, obviously, but like I express and implied user preferences work for me. Removing this and just having user preferences does not work for me, I think, the same way.
Okay, thanks. Okay, go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, just a quick question from a complete messaging newbie. Just the language must be respected there just strikes me as a bit odd. You know, are we really saying that we're going to put a must in the specification that you must behave in this way when it's effectively untestable? I mean, that seems like it's something that would be regulated by legal forces, but I'm not sure it's really about technical interoperability. Do we really mean must be respected, or is it must be able to be expressed?
I think there's ways to design some of the protocol mechanics that are envisioned here that that you could only do so without violating people's preferences, right? That like would demand violation of people's preferences. So it's sort of trying to put a gate on that. But I agree with you, like, yes, there's a lot of this that cannot be enforced in whatever it is that we're going to specify.
I think that probably depends on the nature of the specific preferences in some cases.
Yes.
And that's why especially the data residency one really to me brings that out as like, how are you going to enforce that in the protocol? You know? Yeah, okay, thanks.
Okay, this might be unpopular, but basically we've got the completely wrong language here. This is not the introduction problem. This is the access control problem. That front door that John was talking about, yes, he's got that completely right. You know, every message that I receive over an instant message channel is access controlled, because you can't talk to me on Signal unless I've already decided to accept communications from me. The only thing that you can send without prior authorization is a request for authorization. So really what we've got here is an authorization problem. And you have to have a mechanism that allows somebody to set up an authorization in the first place. And you have to have an access control system so that people can say, I do not want J random fascist sending information into my messaging box. It's an access control problem. And so, I don't think that we can really wordsmith this. I think we've got to go back and cast it in those terms, because once you do that, the whole bit about express user preferences, no, they're not preferences, they're access control policy. And the user has to be in control of that. And that goes to the heart of what AOL and Signal and so on are saying when they want anti-spam built in. They want to protect those existing access controls.
So, thanks. So what I'm hearing right now, and just in case people don't need to get to the mic, what I'm hearing right now is this PR doesn't address the problem that's being expressed here, and this really does need to go back to the list, and this paragraph needs to be reviewed and figure out what text we want to express what people are talking about here. If you want to express your agreement or disagreement with that, that would be helpful.
Yeah, I'm going to close the queue on this, so get in the queue if you have anything else to say. Jonathan.
Yeah, Jonathan Rosenberg. I think almost all of this is stuff that should happen in the working group and not in the charter. Yeah. I'm not a fan of protocol engineering via indirection in the charter. Everyone who has all these strong opinions on identity and preferences and implied versus explicit, can we just do this in the working group? Because instead of like asking for delaying of another 3 months to make a working group, just let's get a working group and have this debate. And I say that because I think a lot of this discussion is losing sight of what the objective of this is. We are not here to design the messaging system and world of messaging we wish we had. That is not the charter of this group. There are existing providers and they sell the products and they have the policies and they make the decisions they've already made, and it's not our job to tell them to do something else. Our job is to provide a way for them to interoperate, and we need to solve just the protocol mechanisms necessary to facilitate that interoperability. That's what we're here to do. So I would love to sort of conclude on the charter text, and I'm pretty much happy with whatever, because we're going to have it all over again in the working group, and we do no benefit to ourselves by delaying it. And the DMA has a deadline in case people didn't know this. So if we want anything to actually be used, another round of charter negotiation helps nobody.
So I guess just looking at the time, because we do need to get to the BOF questions, if anybody disagrees with what Jonathan just said in terms of like needing to continue hashing this out outside of the charter context, then please come to the mic. Ted.
Ted Hardy, scope enthusiast, also BOF question enthusiast, so I'll try and be very fast. I think that the way Jonathan just described this is actually a bigger task than we actually have. because he talked about it as service interoperability across all of the conforming services. But I think some of what's going on here that's problematic for us to understand is actually goes back to the formulation that Brian had at the very beginning. You can think about this as every time you have one of these chats or channels or conversations, you're building an overlay. That overlay has multiple services as underlying providers for that chat or conversation or channel. And that overlay may have its own defaults, which are not inherited from any one of those. And I think part of the thing that the working group has to define is how, when you're building one of these overlaid conversations or channels, et cetera, you get that inheritance. And there are a variety of ways of doing it that the working group has to design and the charter isn't required to design. But I think it's really important that we keep in our brains that we're not trying to solve the problem of service interoperability broadly. It's per overlay we have to solve it. And that's a much more constrained problem. And that's good, because trying to solve it and the full interoperability of all the different aspects of these different services is not going to meet the DMA deadlines, and it's not going to be a solvable problem with the enthusiasm. But if we conceptualize this that way, I think we can understand these BOF questions in a much more useful, hey, can I get this done? And I'm much happier saying yes to those BOF questions than what I think Jonathan didn't actually mean to say.
Okay, I mean, and I think there's broad appreciation for that, that we're trying to be more narrow in scope, and maybe we need to refine it a little bit to get there.
I mean,
Cullen,
my only ask, I was going to say, is just given the timing of everything, I wish that we could resolve right now some text that we could put into the charter that sort of hit this, because everyone seems to be saying roughly the same thing. This should be left to the working group.
Thank you. Yeah. So I think we'll continue iterating on this a little bit on the sideline of the meeting, but I think we need to get onto the BOF questions.
I'm quite happy for this to drop, Matthew, from Matrix. It's not meant to be blocking the working group. I was just trying to get it on the table. So if we don't want to put it on the table, very happy to close the PR, and I've said so on it.
Great. Thank you. I think that would be helpful. Thanks. Okay, I know we didn't get to every single charter aspect that people wanted to discuss, but obviously we're going to keep iterating on some of these points on the list. And if there's one that you really wanted to raise and we didn't get to discuss it, please file an issue or a PR or raise it on the list. And obviously we're going to be continuing to refine the charter after this meeting. So we have time to do that. But we are going to move on to the BOF questions. We're going to be asking to help. So the point of these questions, for those who are new to this process, is to help inform our responsible area director, who is helpfully standing now at the front of the room, Murray, and the rest of the IESG as they think about whether this working group should be chartered and put the charter out for community review. So the first question is, does anyone think the problem statement that we discussed earlier and that Rowan presented is unclear or poorly scoped? If you think it's unclear or poorly scoped, please come to the microphone. David.
Yes, I'm David. I think there's one issue around the scoping, and this is slightly related to the charter. Apologies for that, but I think it is somewhat problematic that the problem statement explicitly places a lot of the spam and abuse questions semi out of scope. I'm worried about the impact that's going to have on the solutions we eventually are going to end up with, and the kind of environment that is going to create. Because we might accidentally dig a very big hole in terms of either a toxic environment or a outright, from a security standpoint, dangerous environment.
Thank you. Please get in the queue if you have opinions about that. Jim.
The charter, the draft charter that's up, seems to talk about the motivation being strictly about user experience, whereas Rowan's draft talks about the DMA. And so if we're needing to satisfy, and I've heard a lot of talk about mentions of the DMA here, if we're needing to satisfy a particular regulatory requirement, or that's a goal of this working group, I think it should be mentioned in the charter, because right now it just seems to be about the about user experience, and our experience has been that user experience is not sufficient to get something deployed.
Thanks. Yeah, we left it out of the charter because it's an unconventional thing to do in IETF charters. It is it's like in the BOF request description. But I think, and there are some backup slides in this deck that you can peruse at your own leisure that explain some of the DMA requirements. But I think in general, we try not to have that as the basis. It's obviously a motivator. But if you look at that and you think that it has an impact on the problem statement scope, that would be useful. I think it's actually stated at a very high level what the requirements are on the gatekeepers under the DMA. So I think everything we've talked about today is potentially within that scope. Vittorio.
Yes, well, I actually wanted to say the two things that have been said, but just briefly, I also think that it's important that, yes, we define the minimal requirements, but they meet at least the requirements that are posed by regulatory requirements around the world. Otherwise, the work is useless. I'm fine with not stating this in the charter if we don't feel like, at the IETF, but it must be a clear agreement between the people in the room. And the other one is about spam. I think that there's a real risk that if we don't address the problem, or at least start discussing how it could impact, we end up with something which will fail because people will try to deploy it, and then it will be immediately used to spam everyone else. And the main players in the field will say, well, don't interoperate because this is just opening up too much spam and abuse on our use. Not just spam, but also harassment and all these kinds of abuses. So I think we should, if possible, at least put it as a second, as a later goal maybe, but not rule it out completely.
Thank you. Eric.
So I don't think we should say anything about DMA in the charter. I understand it's motivating for why this work was successful, but I don't think I think trying to be like, we're not like the consultancy for the EU. So our job is to be something that's good and that does meet those will serve those requirements. But I've read the requirements and they're really quite vague. So so I don't really think there's much fear that that will fail to hit those if we do a proper job otherwise. I'm also sensitive to this point John Peterson and other people raised about spam and abuse. I'm really torn. I don't think there's much. I think maybe like there's a question between, we are not going to solve spam and abuse ever, but even here especially, because those are like very platform specific ways of handling it. What we need to do, and if you think of the email situation, we didn't try to solve spam and abuse in email either. We tried to give the applications of platforms the ability to handle themselves. And so I think, if we were able to come up with a consistent, set of functionality which would enable platforms to handle spam and abuse, we should do that. I not feel comfortable. I understand the situation well enough to be able to do that at this moment. I wonder if there's a way to sort of finesse this a little bit in the charter in terms of having room for in the same ways we made room for discovery thing, make room for protocol support for that if we then need it. Like I say, I feel like that's not entirely adequate, but it's the best I know how to do. So there we are.
And just to point out, not that it is a crystal clear distinction, but this question is about the general problem statement. The specifics of the charter is another question, but I agree they're tied together.
My answer to this question is no. I think it is fine.
Okay.
Thank you. I'm going to close the queue on this question. Go ahead, Matthew.
Hi, Matthew Wild. So I completely sympathize with the point about not wanting to make the whole working group about the DMA. I think that's very sensible. But I also worry that if we don't recognize that as a goal at all, and I think it is implied as a goal because we keep talking about it, we run the risk of possibly defining solutions that are not acceptable to the gatekeepers, for example, and go too far in one direction. For example, the spam and abuse is obviously a big concern to any big player, and it is one of the reasons that they don't just interoperate with anyone. And if we neglect to address that kind of thing, then I worry that we'll end up doing all this interoperability work and no one will end up actually adopting it. And yeah, we've been through this in the past, and a lot of the reason that, say for example, XMPP is no longer implemented is not necessarily because of the technical reasons, but a lot of the, business and operations that go along with operating a massive service. And so we need to be, we need to recognize those things.
Thank you. Rowan.
So from my perspective, spam is specifically mentioned in the problem statement, and in the charter, it's listed as that there's some text about, basically, let's get the ball rolling, and then we can go and do this. We can go and do this a little bit later. So that's my understanding, is that the problem statement does include doing spam metadata, and that there is a mention of it specifically in the charter.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Yeah, Jonathan Rosenberg. So I think the probability that spam is not considered in the discussion is exactly 0. It's sort of like, should we worry about security? How about like backwards compatibility, extensibility? Like, of course, we're all going to do those things too. Do they need to be in the charter? Every single one of them? I don't think so. I think everyone who's working on this understands the risks and the challenges without a doubt. To me, I think it's fine as it is. We're going to work on those things. I think the main point is this group's charter is not to specifically design protocols whose primary functions are spam abuse. And this is why I think what Ecker is saying is right. We're building a messaging interop system which has many design considerations, all of which do not need to be enumerated in the charter, which is obviously inclusive of trying to minimize spam.
Thanks. John.
Yeah, and I do think the problem statement, I think it's pretty clear to most folks here, and I think the way it's been articulated is fine. I mean, on the spam thing, again, I raised this just to make sure that the way that the charter text was going to capture that aspect of the problem statement actually encompassed the way that some of these messaging systems behave, right? And I think we all here know how those messaging systems behave. We've evinced that. We can work this out in the working group.
Thank you. So we have 4 minutes left and we have 4 questions left. So we're going to move on unless you have objections to that. Okay. Does anyone think the IETF is not an appropriate venue for solving the problems we've talked about today? Oh, sorry. Yeah, I'm just going to leave the queue locked so nobody can object.
The answer is no.
Going once, going twice.
Good.
Okay. Does anyone object to forming a working group with the proposed charter modulo changes discussed today? Obviously, we have more refinements that we need to discuss on introduction and discovery, express user preferences, potentially spam, data residency, and metadata. But we've had robust discussion. I have confidence that we will, reach some agreements on those bits of text. So modulo, all of that happening. Does anybody object to forming a working group with approximately the charter scope that we've been discussing? Are you in the queue?
All right, then.
Go ahead.
Fine, fine. No, I do not object, but I think I think it's cool to ask some of these questions in the negative. I think here will be guys to have some affirmative show of support.
You want to take a hum?
Or something, yeah. I mean, I support this, but I just think like to be hopeful to the ADs to see an affirmative show of support that this is good work, not just no complaint.
Brian. Oh, okay. Okay. Well, we can take a hum. So let's do it off the cuff here. So so there's going to be 2 questions. Oh, do we need to use the poll because it's remote?
This is why I like asking the negative questions. But what
Well,
about?
You can just take a show of support in the room. You can take a hum.
Yes. So we'll get support in the room, and if you are in the chat part of our remote participants, please +1 this. Do folks in the positive version of this question, modulo the changes discussed today, think that forming a working group with approximately proposed charter is a good thing? And several +1s. So we had heard no objection when we asked the question, and we got lots of +1s and hums in the room when we asked the positive question. That seems like a good show of support.
Okay, so I think we can go to next.
Yes.
Okay.
We're taking names. Okay, and I'm literally going to ask for people remote to please put their names in. Just so I want you, if you're remote or if you're in the room and you're on the chat, If you are willing to review documents, please type the word review. If you are willing to serve as an author or an editor, please type the word author or editor. If you are willing to chair, please type that word. But I will ask in the room for arms to be thrown in the air as necessary. Do we have folks willing to review documents? Okay, so a good 3/4 of the room raised their hand. I wasn't too worried about. Are there folks who are willing to author documents or edit documents? Okay, so I don't know that I know all the faces here. I know, okay, do we want to, can the, yeah, is that a sufficient, yeah, hold those hands up, please. We are going to blow up the portions of the photo and, yes.
Unless you're wearing a red lanyard.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, red lanyard people. Yeah, so here's the third one. Are there folks who are willing to chair or co-chair this? And so we've got experienced people, we've got inexperienced people, and we certainly would be happy to take both. So if you are, even if you feel like, I don't know about chairing, if you think with an experienced person you'd be willing to do that as a co-chair, please shove your hand in the air. And we're going to do it in the room.
Maybe have them talk to Murray.
Well, you can talk to Murray. But do we have at least a few people who are willing to do? At least one. We've got some hands that are sort of wanting to not be in the air too long, but okay. Is that and
I heard Richard Barnes just volunteered.
If you're curious about it and don't know what it entails yet, come talk to me. Maybe I can talk you into it.
all right. So did Ecker and Richard want to say something about this BOF question? No.
Oh,
Okay.
Richard's in the.
Richard
Yeah.
was just going to clarify Jonathan Rosenberg's comment. Richard is not volunteering to chair this.
Oh man.
That was a
Yeah.
deep fake on the mic there.
All right, and then the next thing is, and again, for folks who are in the chat room, you can indicate, who is planning on implementing the output of this? Well, right. Okay, so there's half a dozen people. Murray, are you noting who those people are? Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And and the rest is our backup slides. So we are at time. I think this, Murray, do you have any final comments? A successful BOF? All right. Thank you all. I think we're on a good path.
Yeah, thank you.
Woo, woo, woo.
We're gonna have like an hour for solution discussion.
No. No, I think that's fine. Good outcome.
Good. Sorry for putting in complications on the data.
Hello.
Thank you, sir.
Like the previous 9 months ago.
Did you get the story when he was
I did. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah.
So
I did feel a little.
Yes. I mean, well,
I did feel a little bad that I asked a semi-scoped question and it seemed to kind of go into after this.
because I did it.
But yeah, no, very well run. And I'm actually going to spend some time in this room, which is not what I was expecting.
I have no. I have no ability to answer that question. And I mean, at the moment, chat is not even within my group.
Yes, sir.
Yes, I thought that asking for hands for chairs was interesting.
I really